So welcome to Sangha Night and welcome to the Great Hall. So yeah, this weekend we celebrated Parinirvana Day, and yeah, it was quite a moving sort of experience, I think, for a lot of us. And yeah, as part of that, we've got a lot of pictures of family and friends of the Sangha and order members who died in the last year around the stupa in the middle of the Great Hall. And I was walking around there, I was looking and reflecting on this, and yeah, I was reflecting on how do we respond and skillfully and creatively to all this suffering, to all this difficulty and pain and suffering in the world and in our lives. And yeah, I ended up with the idea, well, through cultivating positive emotion. That's what we need. We need positive emotion of metta and karuna and yeah, like friendship as well and gratitude. And yeah, so in that way, it's really fitting that tonight Vadanya is going to start our new yeah, what we're moving on to positive emotion. So he's going to tell us a story, introduce us to positive emotion. So with that, I'll hand over to Vadanya.
Thanks, Maitravasan. You've stolen some of my talk, but never mind. Yeah, so since the new year, we've been exploring the 5 great aspects of the spiritual life that are set out by the founder of Triratna, Sangha Night. We've heard that he describes these aspects of the spiritual life as integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And these 5, they form a sort of a path, in that, in a way, one follows the other in a sort of stepwise direction, stepwise way, but nothing is ever as simple as that. And in fact, they all overlap and interpenetrate at every stage. But having said that, so with that caveat, having said that, we could describe these stages, as I like to describe these stages, as firstly become an individual, then become a connected individual, connected to others and the world, and then become more than just an isolated individual, by, in a sense, dying to our old limited self and being reborn in a more positive and expansive, a more expansive and universal being who's sort of a receiving channel, is receptive to what is ultimate and highest in the universe. So we've been looking at, as Maitravasan said, we've been looking at these through the medium of stories. And so far we've been looking at the first one, integration. This is, I mean, integration as we're using it is a word that we borrowed from Jungian psychology. And it means becoming a unified individual rather than being a conflicting bundle of often unconscious drives and subpersonalities, which is how we start actually in life. It means bringing all those different subpersonalities and drives together, including the ones that lurk in the shadows of the unconscious, and getting them to cooperate with what we might call our higher self in charge, using what's positive in all of them, using the strength and energy of all of them. And how we do that is what we've been exploring so far. But tonight, as Maitravasan said, we're going to move on from looking at integration to looking at the second of these aspects of the spiritual life, positive emotion. So we've moved on from how we become an individual, integration, to looking at how we become a connected individual, connected to other people and the world around us through positive emotion. And I'm going to introduce this aspect of spiritual development by telling the story of Ananda, the Buddha's cousin, who for the last 25 years of the Buddha's life was his closest companion, the Buddha's closest companion. So I think that Ananda is perhaps the disciple of the historical Buddha who most clearly illustrates how positive emotion, how the positive emotions are an important part of the path. So Ananda was the Buddha's younger cousin. And about a year after the Buddha's enlightenment, he left his clan and followed the Buddha, becoming a wandering renunciant in northern India. So he would have renounced all worldly ties and possessions, dressed in an old simple robe. I mean, the lovely saffron robes that monks wear these days, they started out being, they were yellow because they were salvaged from rubbish. They were dirty old robes, anything you could find. So he would have renounced all worldly ties and possessions, dressed in a very, very simple robe. Spent most of the year living in the open air, sleeping and meditating under trees, begging for his food, wandering from place to place, meditating and passing on the Buddha's Dharma. So we call those people, these days, we call them monks. They're very often called monks. They're called monks in the literature, but they weren't monks as we know them. They weren't monks who lived a settled, maybe quite comfortable, maybe quite almost socially acceptable life in a monastery. These were spiritual vagabonds. They were forest renunciants. And so Ananda would have practiced in that way for almost 20 years. Then, when the Buddha reached the age of 55 and was maybe getting a bit creaky for a life of constant wandering and living in the open air and sleeping on the ground, he asked Ananda to be his full-time companion and attendant. And from then on, Ananda was the Buddha's constant companion for the last 25 years of his life. And he formed a very, very close relationship with the Buddha. So Ananda's practice of the Dharma was fueled by positive emotion. And one aspect of that positive emotion was his loyalty and service to the Buddha. Ananda delighted to serve the Buddha as messenger, robe washer, errand runner, nurse, protector, and friend. He delighted to make the Buddha as comfortable as it was possible to be in their quite rigorous wandering lifestyle. And he delighted to free the Buddha up, to give as much time as he could to teaching the Dharma and to guiding and building the Sangha. Ananda was delighted to do those mundane tasks out of love for the Buddha and also out of love for beings and a desire for the good of the world. So Ananda loved the Buddha and the Buddha loved Ananda. Just before his final passing, which we heard about on Sunday, just before his parinirvana, the Buddha addressed the whole company of his disciples who were assembled there with him. And he made a point of rejoicing in Ananda's merits. So he said to them all, Ananda is wise. He has many remarkable and wonderful qualities. If anyone comes to see Ananda, they are pleased at the sight of him and they are delighted to hear his voice when he speaks the Dharma. If Ananda is not there, or if he does not speak, they are disappointed. Ananda is like a great king, and the sight of him and the sound of his voice delights both men and women. They are disappointed if they come to see me and do not see Ananda or hear him speak. So this is the Buddha rejoicing in Ananda's merits. And Buddha was basically a lovely chap. He was a really lovely chap. He reminds me a bit of Maitrivasa. Ananda was the man everybody liked. He liked people and people liked him. He seems to have elevated this natural friendliness into a spiritual quality and made it for many, many years his main practice. So Ananda was renowned for his love and his concern for fellow Sangha members, monks and nuns, householder men and householder women. He made a point of visiting the sick or those who were having a hard time. And he cheered people up by his presence and his moral support. It was quite clear that Ananda just cheered people up when he was there. So yeah, he visited the sick, he helped people who were having a hard time, and he did this even when it might mean bending some of the monastic rules a little bit. He maybe put more importance on helping others and connecting with others than he did on always being too precious about his own mental states. Which brings us to the subject of women. Ananda liked people and people liked Ananda. Ananda liked women and women liked Ananda, which did cause some problems. So the Buddha had many, many household of followers who had families, but the rules of conduct that governed the Buddha's renunciant disciples like Ananda, these rules of conduct were very, very strict about women. And maybe that's not surprising. That's not for men, obviously, for men and their contact with women. Maybe that's not surprising, given that many of these were celibate young men living in a hot country, trying to keep a peaceful enough mind to meditate. So a monk was supposed to never be alone with a woman. And many of the monks seem to have avoided women in general altogether, if they could. But Ananda was too kind. He was too kind to take that sort of attitude. Ananda was one of the people that the Buddha most trusted to teach. And he was very glad to teach the nuns and other women. He also liked just being around and being friendly and encouraging women who didn't always have an easy time practicing in those times. In fact, it's Ananda who is credited with persuading the Buddha to allow women to set up an order of nuns, if you want to call them nuns, forest renunciants. The Buddha was quite reluctant about this, but he made it clear that that wasn't because he thought women didn't have the potential to become enlightened. He made that clear. But this was a time when violence was quite common. And the forests where the renunciant followers lived was dangerous. I mean, there were all sorts of wild animals, bandits, all sorts. Probably the Buddha felt that women living the life of a homeless, wandering beggar would be prey to all sorts of problems and dangers, including even rape and abduction. But Ananda liked women. He had sympathy for them. So when a group of women came to the Buddha and asked if they could set up an order of nuns, if you want to call it that, nuns, Ananda spoke up for them. He spoke up for them and he persuaded the Buddha to give his blessing. So Ananda liked women and women liked Ananda. And sometimes women liked Ananda a bit too much. He was obviously a real charmer, Ananda. So there's a sutta in the Pali Canon, the sutta of the nun, in which a nun with a crush on Ananda sends him a message saying she's seriously ill and in pain. She's in fact perfectly healthy. And when she sees Ananda, she sets up somewhere for Ananda to sit and somewhere for her to lie in front of him, so that when she sees Ananda in the distance, she lies down, pretending to be ill, right in front of where Ananda's going to sit. But Ananda susses what's going on. He susses this out. And instead of responding as she had hoped, he gives her a Dharma talk. And he gives her a Dharma talk in which he stresses the need for renunciants to avoid sexual intercourse. So she knows she's been rumbled. And she feels ashamed and she confesses what she was trying to do. Ananda accepts her confession sympathetically. And by the end of the sutta, she is delighted and happy. So she was never really sick, but Ananda has, in a sense, cured her of what was troubling her. So then there's a Mahayana Sutra, the Sarangama Sutra, in which we are introduced to a certain Marangi. And Marangi is a witch. She's a member of a sect of magicians and sorcerers. And this Marangi has a daughter who falls in love with Ananda. And this daughter tells her mother, "You must get an Ananda to leave his celibate life and marry me, or I will die." So Morangi casts a spell on Ananda to attract him to their house. And she uses a magical mantra to make him, the sutra says, as drunk as if he had taken drugs. So in a daze, not knowing what he's doing, alone with Morangi's daughter, the inevitable starts to happen. Ananda is just on the very verge of breaking the precept about sexual misconduct when the Buddha, by his psychic powers, sees what is going on and uses an even more powerful mantra than the one used by Morangi to wake Ananda up from his dazed state. At which point Ananda wakes up from his trance, naked and in bed with a young woman, not knowing how he got there. And the sutta says he was wondering in amazement how he got into this situation. Well, I mean, it's funny and it's meant to be funny, but I wouldn't lay too much stress on it being factually true. What it illustrates, is that Ananda had a bit of a reputation as a charmer. In some parts of the Buddhist world, this was seen as just a bit amusing, but in some parts, Ananda had a rather dubious reputation. Because in the centuries after the Buddha's passing, there seems to have arisen in some parts of the Sangha a sort of what I would characterize as a near enemy of the Dharma. Something that looked like the Buddha's Dharma, but had lost something, really was not. And one feature of this near enemy was that the goal of the spiritual life came to be seen as an individualistic escape from suffering, a cold, aloof detachment without any warmth or positive emotion. And this went along with a rather precious emphasis on not doing anything that might disturb one's peace of mind, and a tendency to see even the minor rules of the monastic life as hugely important as ends in themselves, as though they were really important in themselves, rather than being means to an end. Now, for people steeped in that near enemy of the Dharma, Ananda didn't seem quite the right sort of Buddhist at all. He prioritized kindness and service over solitary meditation and cold intellectual insight. It wasn't that he didn't meditate. Of course, he meditated, but his practice was as much about others as it was about his own mental states. And he wasn't always so strict about some of the monastic rules, especially perhaps relating to women. So for people who saw the Dharma in that way, Ananda had a bit of a bad reputation. He was even blamed for the Buddha dying when he did. It was said that the Buddha could have lived on, perhaps maybe indefinitely. He had that power, but he was so detached that it didn't matter to him whether he lived or died. And all that was needed to persuade him to live on was for someone to ask him to do so at the right time. And Ananda had the opportunity to do this just the time that it was needed, but he missed the chance. So Ananda was to blame for the Buddha dying. Doesn't sound very convincing to me, but there you go. That story was about in some quarters. Ananda was a bit of a spiritual slacker and a bit of a dope, really, something like that. But for most Buddhists who have lived down the ages, Ananda, I think, could be seen not as exemplifying, as it could be seen as exemplifying an ideal approach to practice. Okay, yes, one aspect of enlightenment is about rising above worldly circumstances and worldly cares, being Lokutra, above the world. But as Sangha has stressed, there's no such thing as an individualistic enlightenment, and there's no such thing as an enlightenment that isn't fueled by positive emotion. And the cold, aloof detachment that some people aimed for is not enlightenment at all. Enlightenment means breaking out of the prison of separate selfhood. So to seek enlightenment just for yourself is a contradiction in terms. Enlightenment's a state of profound connection with other beings, a deep solidarity with others. And we get there by becoming more selfless, not by selfishly focusing just on our own mental states. And we get there by metta and the positive emotions. It's an important part of the way we get there. They connect us to others, they connect us to the world, they expand who we can be. They break us out of that prison of separate selfhood. Metta and the other positive emotions connect us to other beings and the world around us. They're part and parcel of any development towards enlightenment. Without them, we go nowhere. We get nowhere in the spiritual life. We stay stuck in our own small, cramped selfhood. So Ananda's focus on the positive emotions was not a distraction from practice, as some people saw it. It was a completely essential part of practice, an essential step in the direction of enlightenment. His selfless service of the Buddha, his service of the Sangha, his connecting with the Sangha, his help of other beings, all of that was, a path towards breaking out of limited selfhood. So that style of practice based on positive emotion was an essential step in the practice in the direction of enlightenment, and it was also an essential step, an essential part of what the Buddha taught. It was an essential part of what the Buddha taught. He taught it in words, but not just in words, not just in the words that have come down to us, but also in the example that he said, the example that the Buddha said of what it means to be enlightened. How does an enlightened being live? Ananda probably knew more about the Buddha than any other person alive. So he may have had something, he may have had a bit of an insight about what enlightenment was like and how to move towards it. And when the Buddha was dying, passing into parinirvana, if you like, and some of his supposedly enlightened disciples thought they were above mourning, or thought that they should be above mourning, or all conditioned things pass, Ananda mourned openly. And what he mourned most, the way he mourned the Buddha, has passed into history, if you like. He spoke of the Buddha as he who was so kind. That was what he most focused on. Not he who was so strict in keeping the rules. Not he who was so detached from worldly concerns. Not even he who was so wise, but he who was so kind. What impressed Ananda most about the Buddha was his kindness. And Ananda very, very much based his own practice on the example of the Buddha. And after his enlightenment, the Buddha devoted his life to helping others, to serving the human race, serving the future, serving the human race by bringing the Dharma into the world and creating a Sangha to not just practice it, but carry it forward, exemplify it, carry it forward, spread it. And often he encouraged his followers to follow this selfless example, to practice themselves with this sort of selfish attitude of serving the world, serving the populace around them, serving the world, serving the future. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha tells his disciples to practice for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of gods and humans. So these words crop up over and over again. You practice not just so that you don't have to suffer, not just so that you can enjoy lovely mental states and sit under a tree, but you practice for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of gods and humans. Those words crop up, as I said, over and over again. I once somebody did a a search for me in the Pali Canon, in the Pali version of the Pali Canon, for those words, and they cropped up all over the place. So in contrast to the sort of individualistic approach that some of the Buddha's later followers fell into, after the Buddha's death, a style of Buddhism arose that put those words, practice for the welfare of the many, put those words and that attitude at the very center of the Dharma, the very center of their Dharma practice. And this movement called itself the Mahayana, which many of you will have heard of, the great vehicle. And for the Mahayana, the ideal Buddhist was the Bodhisattva, someone who is seeking to become more enlightened, but not just for their own sake, but for the sake of others and the world. Speaking mythically, I mean, this is a myth, but speaking mythically, the Bodhisattva was said to postpone their enlightenment in order to stay in the world and, as it were, usher other people into enlightenment. We shouldn't take that literally. We shouldn't take that literally. That's a mythic way of expressing something. What it really means is that the Bodhisattva, the ideal Buddhist practitioner, doesn't just focus on their own enlightenment for their own sake. This would just be more and more of the same old selfishness that we need to transcend. Of course, the Bodhisattva practices the Dharma. They meditate, they spend time in solitude, they develop their positive qualities, but they do this to be as much use to others, to be as much use to others as they can, as well as for their own sake. And this different motivation, this more altruistic, more selfless motivation, makes all the difference. It makes all the difference. It means that their practice is based on positive emotion. And it means that it leads to a genuine enlightenment that's suffused with positive emotion, with love for others and the world. Enlightenment is impossible without positive emotion and a more selfless attitude. So Ananda practiced in that way. And his practice did in fact lead into enlightenment. So when he's about to pass away, the Buddha tells Ananda, "For a long time, Ananda, you have been in the Buddha's presence, showing loving kindness in acts of body, speech, and mind, beneficially, blessedly, wholeheartedly, and unstintingly. You have achieved much merit, Ananda. Make the effort, and in a short time you will be liberated." And Ananda takes that advice, and in a short time he breaks through to genuine enlightenment. So, showing loving kindness in acts of body, speech, and mind, beneficially, blessedly, you have achieved much merit. So merit, sometimes, merit, people don't like the idea of merit, but merit is a sort of spiritual momentum. It's a sort of spiritual oomph that propels us towards growth. And without merit, we ain't going anywhere. Without merit becomes very important again in Mahayana Buddhism. Part of our practice is to gather merit. And we do that by the practice of actions based on loving kindness as much as anything else. So you have achieved much merit, Ananda. Make the effort, and in a short time you will be liberated. And Ananda indeed is liberated. So we could see Ananda, I think, as a great example of what Mahayana Buddhists would see as the ideal Buddhist, the Bodhisattva. He didn't focus in a precious way just on his own mental states, although he needed to work to stay in a good mental state to help and serve and encourage others. He didn't even focus on his own enlightenment, although he became enlightened as a result of his practice. He focused on love and concern for others, on service, serving the Buddha, helping his fellow practitioners, and serving the beings of the future, us. Because the true Bodhisattva is not just being sort of kind all the time. Well, he is, but it's not just about that. The true Bodhisattva is concerned not just with their own enlightenment, but with the enlightenment of everybody, with the evolution of consciousness, on this planet, the evolution of the consciousness of the human race. They're about, a bodhisattva is about all of us becoming enlightened. That's what this myth of postponing enlightenment until everybody else enters is all about. They're about all of us becoming enlightened and their enlightenment serving that. And Ananda's contribution to that project that I hope we're involved in, that contribution to the people of the future really was second only to the Buddha's. We owe him an immense debt because Ananda was with the Buddha more than anybody else. And he had a phenomenal memory, an absolute phenomenal memory. And he made a point of remembering the Buddha's teachings, reciting them and passing them on to others, making sure they were remembered and passed on as a service to the world and as a service to future generations. So when, after the Buddha's death, there was a council called to pull together all the Buddha's teachings and sort of standardize it, if you like, and record it and get people to learn different bits of it. And Ananda was the most important person present because Ananda knew what the Buddha had said. Most of the suttas in the Pali Canon start with the words, "Thus have I heard." And these were Ananda's words as he repeated what the Buddha said. And we hear them just about every time we read one of the Buddha's teachings. When we hear, "Thus have I heard," we hear Ananda speaking. Without Ananda, the Dharma would never have been passed on to future generations in the way that it has. I would say that Ananda, because of his practice of the positive emotions, far from being just a bit of a nice guy who was a bit of a spiritual slacker, was the most important of the Buddha's disciples. He was someone who followed a real true path to enlightenment, to full enlightenment, the full enlightenment that's not just of the head, but of the heart. And he was one of the Buddha's disciple. He was the Buddha's disciple who had the biggest impact on the world. And I think he's the Buddha's disciple who perhaps we should take as our best example.